All right, welcome back. We've been talking through data access technologies in the previous module. Looked at a bunch of cool stuff with ADO.NET, and remember, it's still there, it's still alive. It's just a lot of the times we tend to work at a higher level than ADO.NET though these days. Looked through Link, some really cool stuff there, XML and linked XML, some great ways to manipulate data, regardless sort of where it's coming from. And with that, I was saying that ADO.NET is sort of that core foundation of really how we've accessed data in .NET going back to .NET 1.0. But if you look at sort of that sample code I had in the last module, that was some pretty tedious code just to pull back a single result set and then go and loop through it there. And so really, I think most developers these days are looking for a way to sort of get out of having to bridge the gap between, say C# or .NET and T-SQL or whatever your backend database engine happens to be, but then also not have to write all that code to just give us some nicer querying semantics and data manipulation semantics and things like that, on top of our data sets back there.
Which has been in NHibernate was one of the tools that came about, and then Entity Framework is the Microsoft tool for that.
Yep, definitely. And so in this module, we're going to come in and take a look at data access with Entity Framework. We'll take a look at entity data models, but really, I won't demo that. We'll come back in and look at some different workflows of ways that you can go about creating these entity data models. We'll look at really demo primarily database first or code first sort of workflows there. And then look at another feature. Really, this is sort of a hybrid between services and data. And it's a thing called WCF Data Services, which is a way of basically taking a data model, wrapping it up in a standardized set of RESTful services. And if your data model is in an entity framework, it's really easy to go do that. So we'll take a look at that. So starting out with entity data models. With entity data models here, as Bruno was mentioning, in Hibernate, prior to this we had Link to SQL, and tons of other ones that are out there, these object relational mappers. And the idea here is that, back somewhere in our infrastructure, we've got a relational database that has, our tables and relationships and all that kind of stuff sitting in them. But then on the other end is, our code. And as developers, at least most days now, we tend to be working around objects and classes and that kind of stuff. And so, if you're a XAML dev, you might be into building, MVVM models and all that kind of stuff, and having ways of representing data as objects as opposed to relational structures. And so we've got classes, and we might have associations between those classes and inheritances and all that kind of stuff. And so the problem that we have as developers is that we've had to bridge that gap between those two layers, in the past using technologies like ADO.NET. But with object relational mappers, they give us a way to provide some intermediate structure that can do the mapping between the relational structures on the database end and the more object-oriented structures that we have back in our programming models. And so Entity Framework is an example of an ORM. Right? There's other ones out there in Hibernate, etc. And so Entity Framework does this sort of mapping by going in and creating various models. We first of all have a model. Now this is, in this sense, I'm talking about sort of the designer-centric approach to creating an entity framework. But on one end, we have a way of modeling the data structures in the database. And we have a model for that called the Store Schema Definition Language, or SSDL. On the other end, we have a way of modeling the objects that we deal with on the code side. And that's our Conceptual Schema Definition Language, or our CSDL. And then between those two is a mapping language called the MSL, or the Mapping Specification. And those are going to give us this way of sort of representing both sides and then providing a way to bridge the gap between those. And Entity Framework has standardized, structured ways to do that, and even design tools built into Visual Studio to help us describe all of those things. And where those models get wrapped up in Visual Studio are what's called an entity data model. And there's this .edmx file that has XML in it, and the XML stores all those models for us. Another way to think about Entity Framework, though, is sort of architecturally, from a database perspective versus a code perspective. Up on the code side, Entity Framework gives me really a set of services that I can consume programmatically. These object services. And in previous versions of Entity Framework, we had what was called the object context. We've now kind of wrapped that up into another object around that called the DB context. And this is going to help me do things like establish the connection to the actual database on the back end, as well as doing change tracking or state tracking of the entities that I pull through those services. Object services, though, sits on top of another layer called the entity client. And this is, in fact, an abstraction of ADO.NET. There's a connection, a data reader, a command, and all that kind of stuff that are specific to Entity Framework and are really almost a proxy for the underlying provider. And there's, in fact, even a querying language. There's Entity SQL that you can use. That's a SQL-like language that you can use against the entities down there at the entity client layer. But again, I did mention that these guys all rely on ADO.NET. So underneath that are these Entity Framework providers. And so we need to have a provider that Entity Framework can talk to that understands the relational database engine that it's talking to on the back end. And so how do we get Entity Framework? Well, you're going to get it with NuGet. You got it? Sorry. So Entity Framework 6 is now actually RTM, and this is now an open source project. You can go get nightly builds of Entity Framework from entityframework.codeplex.com. And so if you want to make sure that you're using the latest version, you can either pull that in from NuGet, or Visual Studio can help you do it if you build an EF6 model in the designer back there. The team is really great. They're like I say, they're publishing nightly builds. In fact, they check into that repository. They've got meeting notes up there about their design reviews and all that kind of stuff. And if you're really interested in it, you can grab the source and even submit pull requests to make contributions into it. And then, as I said, it's installable from NuGet. You can either do that from the command console or you can do it from the package manager GUI, either way that you like. And if you just use the Entity Framework package, you'll get the current release version of that. If you add, Bruno did a package earlier with the -pre on there, and that's going to get you pre-release versions as well. And it'll pull in beta versions of it as well if you want that. For data providers, Microsoft ships with support for SQL Server as well as for SQL Server Compact Edition. The SQL Server one just is included in the Entity Framework package. So when you go grab that package, it includes the SQL Server provider. If you want SQL Compact Edition, there's the Entity Framework.SQL Server Compact NuGet package that you can go and install. Now there's also third parties, though, that can produce these, right? These are a standard that third parties can produce their own providers if they want. DevArt's a third party that has providers for, MySQL and Oracle and SQLite and other ones out there as well. These are paid for things, so you'd go pay for them for those. Firebird's another open source database engine. They have an Entity Framework provider that you can use. So it doesn't have to be just about SQL Server. All right. So we've got this idea of these models, right? Conceptual, structural, mapping, and all that kind of stuff. And so the question is, how do we go about building them? How do we get these models into place? And so there's really a couple of workflows that you as a developer can go through as you look at developing with Entity Framework. And so the way that you would think about the model that's right for you is based on a couple of inputs. First of all is, do you have an existing database or do you need to create a new database, right? So you're going to want to answer that question ahead of time. And it kind of depends on who you are in the organization or what your organization is. If you have DBAs and they're making the databases with formal SQL scripts and all that kind of stuff, and you can't go tweak the database, then you've got an existing one. Or it could be that you're just working locally, you got local DB or SQL Express or even a full-blown Azure SQL database or whatever, but you want to generate the structure based on the code or whatever, or some new structure. So that's part of that, is do you have an existing database or do you want to make a new one? The other question is sort of how you want to work, right? Do you want to go in and use the designer, pretty pictures and drag and drop, and the toolbox to describe your models visually, or do you just want to write classes and attributes and things like that to sort of go do those mappings? And none of those options are wrong. It's just what you have or what you want. That's sort of what you have to think about.
So you're saying, Brett, I could actually just start writing code and create a database from code that I've written?
Yep. So and we'll come back and see that here. So if you have an existing database and you like the designer experience, right? You want to go into Visual Studio, you like the tooling in there, you like to visualize your databases with entities and relationships and all that kind of stuff, then that's database first, right? You can point to an existing database. There's a designer tool that you can use inside Visual Studio, and you can diagram things out. We even have support for multiple diagrams now. So if you have subsets of data within your framework, you could have customer data in one diagram and product data in another one, et cetera, out there as you want to there. It'll let you reverse engineer an existing database. So I can point that designer at an existing DB, say, you go figure out the structure, and then create for me the conceptual and structural and mapping models, and actually do the code generation to produce the classes for me, back in my my project. So that's really cool.
So in other words, if I had like a customer orders scenario, and I'm using Entity Framework, it'll give me a collection of customers with an embedded collection of orders in each of my customers.
Yeah, it creates the mappings across those. You were asking about joins earlier on. Using frameworks like this, I don't have to do joins because they already understand how to navigate through those relationships as long as they're defined. So database first, certainly a good choice. Model first says I don't want to write code, but I don't have a database either. I want to describe my database and let it go generate the code and the database for me, right, based off this diagram that I built. Right, so that's the model first pattern. You do it using the designer in Visual Studio, good tooling and all that good stuff. And then when you're ready, you tell it to go generate the database, and it'll actually produce scripts that you can run against your backend database engine to populate it with the structures that you want to have. With database first, remember the database already existed, and you generated your structures off of that. If you wanted to change the database, you can actually do that. The DBA could go add a column or something like that. And then what you can do is go tell it to update the model based on the database and have it add the additional changes that have come in. So that's pretty cool. With model first, there's really no sort of way for me to take model changes and update my database, right? So it's kind of you do it right once. If you got it wrong, you kind of have to go do it again. Sort of a thing to start over. But it does give you a good way to create a visual database and then sort of start with it. Write code, if you want to write code and you don't have a database, then that's sort of the true code first model. I know what I want. I just want to write some classes and let Entity Framework figure out how to save it for me, right? So I'm going to describe my classes, and I'm going to let it figure out what the data structure has to look like. And so with there, you create your classes in code. The mappings are all defined in code. You then basically let the Entity Framework generate the database for you. And then you can use what are called code first migrations. Whereas you manipulate your code model, it can look at the changes and generate update scripts and update code to maintain the data structure on the back end. So that's pretty cool, right? So it does give you a way to push changes back to the back end database without, or do so in a non-destructive way. And then lastly, it's still called code first because I write code before the model exists, but another way to think of it is code second. The database already existed, and now I'm writing classes that are going to somehow magically map up to the objects that are in there. So I'll still just go create classes in code, but it's going to be based on the structures that are already in the database. There's another package you can get. It's called the Entity Framework Power Tools that you can use to sort of reverse engineer the code that you would use for code first. It doesn't build the model, it just builds the code part. So that's kind of cool. So something else to think about there. So those are sort of the four models that you have. And I would say in general, probably the most popular are either database first or code first. So I'm going to first come in here and take a look at database first. Remember I had that positions database, and so I basically kind of want to go in and build an entity model on top of that I can go use. So with that said, let me jump over and do a demo of a database first workflow. So remember that good old positions database? It's the same one that we were using in the previous demo, so I won't rehash that, but let me just get connected in here so we can see it. And remember that in there was a collection of tables, cruises, places, positions, time zones. There was also a view and a proc, but I don't actually end up using these here, but they're there, and at least you can see them. It's a real database, right? So there's some real structures out there. And so I want to go sort of create some code that's going to help me query that or manipulate that data very easily here. So back in my assets, I've got a begin folder here, and I've got a pre-written solution that's got some apps already in place for me to use. So I'm going to open this up. And I don't think I've done Windows 8, I've done console apps, I've done web apps, I haven't done a WPF app. So this one had some WPF apps in it. All right. And so in this case, we're looking at database first here. So I've got a database first project, and I've currently got that set as my startup project, so I'll make sure that's true. And a very simple app, there's just a main window.xaml.
So that's like the traditional approach. We have a database, let's start thinking about making the code writing a little bit easier.
Yeah, I know there's a database of positions back there, and I just want to see a list of all the positions that are in that database, right? Those latitude and longitude positions back there. And so I want to have a button and I want to have a list view that shows them. I just need a way of figuring out how to go do it. You know, I could have used ADO.NET and written code to go retrieve them. That's what I did in the last module. But here I don't want to do that. I want to figure out a way to get my existing data back.
I don't want to do SQL connections, SQL commands, SQL reader, data sets.
Exactly. So all I've got here in this app, in the main window, I've got a button that I'm going to use when I want to go see the positions. And then down below there, I've got a list view that I'm going to want to populate with the positions when they come back. And my list view has a very basic little template that's just going to show the position ID, the latitude, and the longitude for whatever gets returned. Cool. So in order to work with my position data, I need a data model. So I'm going to right-click up here and go to my, actually, before I do that, if I look at my references, there's nothing about entities or anything like that in here, right? So I'm going to go into my Solution Explorer. I'm going to right-click on my project and add in a new item. And this is going to be from the data category. Whoa, where'd you go? That was weird. From the data category, I'm going to pick the, oh, that's weird. A little graphics issue there, but okay. I'm going to pick the ADO.NET Entity Data Model. That keeps blanking away on me there. Let's see if I can give this guy a name. This is going to be my Positions Entity Model. And I'll go ahead and add that in. And so now this is, remember, this is the designer-focused, database-first workflow here. So because it's designer-focused, it's really asking me, do you want to get it from a database? That's database first. Or do you want to build your model first? That's the model first one, right? So I have in the database already, so that's the one that I want to use. And so now it says, well, where's your database? And so I'm going to jump back over here. Remember, I've got this connection, or this SQL database out here, and this was that fully qualified name to my Azure SQL database. So I'm going to point this off at my Azure SQL database, and I'll make a new connection. That's going to be the server I want to go point to. I've got my SQL admin login and my top secret credentials here. Enter those in. And if everything works, I ought to be able to click that drop down. It actually went and talked to the server, says, yep, we see this positions database. That's the one I want to point to. I could test it, but I've already tested it just by seeing those databases in that drop down list. But okay, so there's my connection string. Connection strings get saved in your application config file, and SQL Azure or Azure SQL databases currently still only support standard SQL authentication. So that means my password, if it's saved in the config file, unless I go to encryption, is going to be clear text. And so that's why it's asking me here, hey, are you really okay with us putting your password in the config file? And I'm like, yeah, just go ahead and stick it in there. So it'll show up in my config file. But this is a connection string. It's a little more intense than the ADO.NET connection string that we saw, but actually if you look, you'll notice that there is, starts all the way over here, an ADO.connection string in there. Right? So it's an entity connection string that's wrapped up around an ADO.NET connection string. But you'll notice in there, it's actually referring off to where's my CSDL, the conceptual model, as well as my SSDL, the structural model, and the MSL, which was the mapping model. Right? So it's really basically saying, here's the models to use on top of this database. And it's going to save it into my config file for me. But it's also, the name that I use here is also going to be the name of the DB context object that gets created. So I want to come up with a good name here. So I'm going to go ahead and just call it my positions context. And go on to next. And now it's asking me, do you want to use EF6 or EF5? Remember I said EF6 is now RTM, so I'd recommend using it. In fact, they even did a lot of work with EF6 to make it more backward compatible with .NET 4 than Entity Framework 5 was. So if you're still on EF4, you actually want to use 6, not 5. You know, you want to jump a level to get better compatibility. So anyhow, So I'll go to Entity Framework 6. And it's now going to go look at the schema of my database back there. Remember, I had those tables, and I had the views, and there was the stored proc and all that. I'm just going to get the tables, though. And I'm going to let it come up with smart object names for me, or at least I hope it does. It's going to try and pluralize or singularize my class names depending on what they're actually called in the database. It's going to look for foreign keys. I'm not actually importing any stored procs or anything, so that third one doesn't matter. And I'm going to leave the model namespace as it was and just hit finish. And so at this point, remember I asked for EF6, but I told you when I started out, I didn't have any framework references. So it's actually going to use NuGet and pull those Entity Framework packages in for me. So we'll give it a second here. There's some T4 templates that run, so you get these security warnings. I'm going to tell it just not show those to me again and say OK. And let it chug away here. Cool. All right. So here's my graphical designer, right? This is the entity model representation of the data that's back there in that database, right? Cool. And so I can see that it found the position and the cruise and the place and the time zone. Notice the smart renaming messed up on cruise. So it dropped the E off there. So I can just add it back in, no problem. And name this navigation property over here as well. And so like Bruno, you were asking, if I have a position, do I have to join it up to the cruise? Well, no, I can just use this navigation property and say, hey, position, go to your cruise. And then that'll take me to the cruise, and I can get the name and the description and all that stuff right off of there. It's really cool, right? So anyhow, so I could tweak this model, rename things, delete things, add things, whatever it is that I need to. And when I'm ready to use it, before I do, I'll just go to a build. I just did a Control-Shift-B, so down here I see build succeeded, so that all looks good. And so now I've got the model, I want to go use it. So back over in my main window, remember I had this button to go get positions, right? And so this is where I can start using this Entity Framework thing. So I have then basically this position context, right? Remember that object that or that name that I gave to that, oh, did I call it positions context? Yes, I had plural, positions context. Okay, so but that I said is the name that I gave to the connection string is actually the name of this DB context that I'm going to use to interact with it. And I'll just call this, context equals, and this is going to be a new positions context for me. And that context then basically has on it all of the data sets or DB sets of the data for those entity collections that I'm going to be able to retrieve, right? If I go back and look at that model, and in fact, I can go to the model browser. This is sort of a little tree-based view of my model over there. You'll notice that I have, again, this positions model over here. There's these entity types, the cruise, etc. And then as I come down, why am I not finding what I want to find there? Sorry. Well, this is my conceptual, or the storage model down below, my conceptual model up above. Yeah, I'm not seeing it where I want to see it. Sorry. But basically, these things will get turned into what we call DB sets. I'll have one called positions. I'll have cruises, places, time zones, etc. That I can then go navigate using a link. So back over to my code. So let's do v var. I'm going to call this cruise 2 from p and context dot positions. Where p dot, why are you not happy with me? Ah, that was weird. I don't know, some weird IntelliSense thing there. All right, retype it and it's happier now. Where p.cruiseid.
Typo there with the 2.
Oh, thank you. Well, that's weird. Cruise 2. Cruise ID is equal to 2. Select P or something like that. Cool. So there's my cool little link syntax, right? Now think about that ADO.NET query right, that I had before, and the using of the connection with the command, and then the command that executed the reader, and then looping through the reader until it couldn't read, and then I had to go pull all the column values out. Tell me that's not nicer.
Very clean.
Yeah, this is so much nicer to be able to do that, right? And now I can take this cruise 2 that I have, and I have this positions list, which is that list view back on my main page.xaml, and I can just set its item source, up to the data that came back from cruise 2. Pretty cool. And that's going to data bind that right up for me. Now, I'm not doing MVVM and all that good stuff. I'm just trying to focus on Entity Framework and that idea. But you could definitely be pulling these into, collection properties that you have on your view model and then binding those up through data binding, et cetera. So no problem. Definitely can do that. And so now if I come back here and run this, get positions, it's going to go call into that. Hopefully not crash. And it does. Let's get just sounds like it was unhappy with something down there. I'm not getting my data back. Why am I not getting my data back?
Look at context positions. Is there data in there?
I did have the right database, right? Oh. Let's go this way. Actually, I may be running into a timeout. Let's do it this way. I'm going to steal their code. Well, my code from my snippet. Same thing. I'm only taking 5 rows back from it. There's 1,100 rows. I may very well be running into a timeout or something like that there. So this is very close to the same thing. I'm just pulling them back though, and then only taking the top 5. Same idea. And the positions to list. Yes, that I was not doing. So that may have been my error there too. Sorry. And the reason why is you're getting back a DB set and you can't directly bind to that. I had to turn it into a list. Let's see if this works better now though. There we go. A little bit better. All right. So a little mess up on mine. I bet what the fix was just this extracting it out to a list. And that turns it into an IEnumerable that I can bind up to. But there's my position IDs and my latitudes and my longitudes all coming back there for me. So that's really cool. And for me, I think the impact of that is, first of all, I didn't write a single line of transact SQL, right? So I'm a SQL guy, so for me, I kind of miss it, right? But for those that don't want to have to do it, that's fantastic. And for, think about other devs who have to come in and read this code. They don't have to be proficient in both. They just need to know that magically there's this collection of positions that are coming from somewhere. And here's their structure, and they just need to be able to do link on top of that, right?
Well, one of the misconceptions, too, is that Entity Framework can't do stored procedures, but it can. So if you've invested a lot of R&D in optimizing your stored procedure, you can still leverage those.
Most definitely. In fact, a lot of enterprises have a stored proc-only policy in terms of client access to the data structures and things like that. And you saw, as I went through that designer, stored procs was one of the choices that I could pull in. And that would just then become an executable method off of this data context that I could pass arguments into and get results back out of. So really cool stuff, right? So, obviously, in this short amount of time, we're not going to be able to dig deep. There's a lot of great material out there on NAD Framework and some fantastic tutorials just on msdn.com. In fact, here I can stick it up here real
Julie
quick.
Lerman writes a lot about it on MSDN.
Yep, msdn.com/EF. Come on, fat fingers. Oh, man. You get the point. I'm going to stop typing.
It's been a long day.
Anyhow, so there, msdn.com EF, and then it'll take you out, and there's actually a ton of great resources up there. Oh, yeah, sure. So, and like I say, there's some fantastic tutorials up there, short little videos that you can walk through, and they talk through a ton of these different concepts. But all right, so with that said, then let me zoom back out and jump back to my deck briefly. So that was the database first model. What about code first, right? So with code first, that's where you say, I want to make the database. I don't necessarily have one already in place. And so a lot of devs really like this, especially if you're not in a shop where you have formal DBAs and you don't want to have to go figure out how to make a SQL database or whatever. You can just let Entity Framework take care of that for you. You describe your classes. We've got attributes or various ways that you can map different classes up to build relationships and all that good stuff. And you just say, hey, look, here's my model. You go make it happen, right?
Yeah, if you think about it, a lot of times people develop this relational model, and it's not how a developer would have thought about it. They think in terms of objects. So the question becomes, do you think in terms of a developer first, or do you think more in terms of a DBA first? And that's why we've got these two worlds.
Yep, indeed. All right, so let's jump back and take a look at creating code first. So I'm going to set my code first project as my startup up here. And it's very similar to where we started last time. I've got a WPF app, although this time I'm going to allow you to add objects in, right? So I didn't do an insert or anything like that. I just did querying of the data back here. So here we'll let you generate a new one and then also populate this list view down below with the ones that are in there. So that's my basic structure there. And in order to do that, I need to first of all have a class that represents a position. So I'm going to steal back over here to my code snippets and just copy out this class called position, and let's go make that class file. So I'm going to add in a new class. I'm going to call it position.cs, and then I'll just replace the code in there. And I mean, this is a pretty basic class. It's just position ID, latitude, longitude. Obviously, you can have all the other properties there as well. I'm not going to get into that right now, but there you go. Very simple model. And somewhere I have to have something that says, hey, take this and include it in some data context or DB context and have that DB context somehow magically map up to a database. I need Entity Framework, and I don't have an Entity Framework in this project. So this is where I'm going to go to NuGet, right? So I'm going to right-click on my project, come down to Manage NuGet Packages. You saw the Package Manager console earlier. You can do the install package, Entity Framework. That'll work. But you can also just go search. So I'm opening up this. I'll go to Online and search, and then I can just type in Entity Framework, and you'll actually already see it there on the page, but bingo. And you'll notice that there's Entity Framework. And you'll notice that right now I've got stable only. Remember Bruno was talking earlier about pulling in pre-release. The GUI way for that is this little drop down here. You can say include pre-releases, and that's the -pre command or option. But stable only, and over here I can see that in fact I'm pulling in Entity Framework 6.0.1. So it's going to be ES6 that I get with this. So I'll hit install. And that's going to go pull all the packages and libraries and all that good stuff in for me. So now I've got support for that. And now what I can do is go in and add in some code to create this DB context. In the design first one, or database first one, I let the designer create this DB context class for me. In fact, it was that positions context that I was referring to in code here. But for me, because this is code first, I've got to go generate it myself, and it's not that hard to do. So this is going to be my positions context. Add a new class. And simply replace that code. And this is all it is. Say, hey, positions context, you inherit from DB context. And that wouldn't have been in my project, the system.data entity, if I hadn't already pulled in that Entity Framework package, right? So I can go reference that or import that namespace, boom. And so now I basically say, hey, look, this context provides access to a set of positions through this property called positions, right? And that's going to be that query source. And so now when I go run this for the first time, DB context is going to look and go, I don't know where my database is. I'll go make one. Right now, you can actually tell it where you want it to be made, but by default, it's going to look on your local machine and say, do you have local DB? And local DB is a feature of SQL Server 2012 and later. And it basically allows sort of user-specific instances of databases, right? And so it's a real easy way. It's more lightweight than SQL Express was with user instances. And so it can basically just create these these databases, attach them to this local DB process, and then just call up against it.
Are you saying at runtime it's just magically going to create the database?
Yep. It's magically going to create the database for me. Now, in the VM that I'm running in, I actually happen to have SQL Express installed. So I have both. I have SQL Express and local DB. And the code first stuff here is going to look at first and say, do you have SQL Express? If you do, I'll use that. If you don't, you have local DB? If you do, I'll use that. If you don't, I have either of those, I'll go, right? So because I have SQL Express, mine's going to end up in SQL Express, not local DB. I'll just point that out, even though I have them both. Right? So in fact, if I jump back over to my SQL Management Studio, and let's go connect up to my SQL Express instance. And in my databases here, oh, it looks like there actually was an earlier run from a test. Let me go ahead and delete that. Oh, is it going to let me? It's not going to let me. Okay. The user account that I've come in as does not have admin permissions on SQL Express right now. So I did a switch of the user account I'm logged in as. I'm going to just give it I'm going to wing it and see if it can just use the database that's there. That may mean that there's already some existing positions in it. So, it's not even letting me get to it. Ratchet fratting. Well, let's see. We'll see what happens. Let me run it and see what happens here. All right. So then I need to come in and add some code. And this is my add position click down here. Let me steal the code for that. And so remember, in this case, I'm actually going to let you create a new position. So I'm going to go to those two text boxes that were on my form, pull their values out as the latitude and longitudes, right? And if there's any parsing errors, we'll just return zeros instead, right? But otherwise, we'll try and pull those back. We're going to new up one of our POCO plain old CLR object positions and just populate its properties with the values we pulled out of that text box. And then I tell my positions context to basically go add to the positions table that new position object and then save changes. That's kind of like my insert and my commit, if you will, right? Those bottom two lines down there. Then I'm going to turn right back around and query the data, pull all the rows out of the positions, and cast them as a list and bind them up to my list view out there. So let's see, fingers crossed. Let's see if we can hook up here. Data exception, yeah. So it looks like I'm actually running into an issue there with access to that database. At least I see that it was trying to get out to that database. Now the fix for that is for me to, and we'll try this really quick. Oops, sorry. I'm going to close up. Actually, we'll go ahead and be super smart about it. You go ahead and sign out. Remember, this is an Azure VM that I'm actually connected up to here. And so I'll go reconnect to it as a different user.
So you're looking for admin privileges.
Yeah, so that dev user account that I'm coming back into is actually the name of the administrator account on the machine. And the reason I wasn't using it before, there we go, is because administrative users on Windows Server 2012 can't do Windows 8 apps. So some of my demos were Windows 8, so I made a regular user who was also an admin, but forgot to give admin access to SQL Express. So that's fixable. But that's the situation. That's why that happens. So let me jump back over here. I'll get back into Studio. And in fact, we ought to be able to go back over to my SQL Express now. And delete that database. There we go. Cool. All right, and let's try and run that app. This might begin. Cool. And we should be right back where we were. Oh. Let's run it. I clicked the button. Now remember, the first time you do this, it's got to go, look, do we have the database? No. Where's the database? I don't know. Should we make a database? I guess I'll make a database. Where are we going to make the database? And then it goes and makes the database. And then it goes, now we can connect. So it takes a little bit of time the first time, right? But notice it did actually work. So I've inserted, this was position ID number 1 into my database, and it took the 33 and the 112. Let's go change that to 111 and 34 or something like that, and go add position again, and boom, there's position number 2 with 34 and negative 111.
That was such a smooth recovery. It looked like you planned it that way.
Gee, thanks. Yeah, so I mean that's pretty cool. And if I jump back over here and look at my SQL Express database now, sorry, let's refresh. Positions is one that I made manually earlier. Now I've got this EF demos again, and when I drill into my tables, there's the positions. When I open it up, you know, there's the columns that got made for me, and it just went and did all of that. I can go select all the rows in there, and we'll see my positions 1 and 2, and all that good stuff, right? So it made a real database for me back there. That's pretty darn cool stuff, if you ask me. Right now, while we're here, let me go ahead and add in. Sorry. Ooh, built in. All right, I'm not going to mess with this. Let's go this way. SA. No, it can't. It's got to be Windows auth. I may run into a problem here with the rest of that demo then. Okie dokie. So I'm going to stick here where I'm at, and let me jump back over to my deck, right? So hopefully, though, at least you see the problem I'm fighting there is a security issue on SQL Express. I'll just have to fix that. But we looked at those 2 different workflows, database first and code first, and sort of saw different ways that we can go about that. WCF Data Services, then, is something else entirely. Although it works well with Entity Framework, it doesn't require Entity Framework. And so basically, WCF Data Services is a convenient way to create an OData service on top of a data model, right? And OData is really, you know, again, we've talked a little bit about REST. It's going to come back up again in the next module. But if you think about sort of how we deal with RESTful services, the problem with RESTful services is that, or one of the problems with them, is that they're not as structured as SOAP. SOAP, we've got metadata. I can walk up to a service. It's discoverable. I know what it does. I can ask it questions. It tells me all about itself and all this. And with REST, I got to go find the developer and say, what's your APIs? And what are the URLs that I call them? What do I pass into them and all that? Somewhere there has to be sort of a documentation of this RESTful service. Well, OData is really just a formalized REST API that says, hey, look, we have a standard way that we can use to submit or basically handle, effectively CRUD operations on data, using this REST API. And it could be written on any platform, it could be against any set of data, it could be consumed from any client, but we're going to stick to this consistent API across them, right?
And it's an open standard, by the way. It's not Microsoft controlled.
Yeah, definitely. So, although we did spawn it.
We kicked it off.
Yep. So, yeah, and that's great. It's one of those ones that's really gotten some great industry support out there, et cetera. You can learn more about it, odata.org, and find out all you want to. But that's the cool thing about OData is that it's a formal RESTful API. And there's some out there, but it's nice to have that. So WCF Data Services, then, is just one of the ways in .NET that you can create OData services. And really, you can take just about any model that you have and expose it using WCF Data Services. But if you've got an Entity Framework model, a great way to do that is with a WCF Data Service. So WCF Data Services is now 5.6. that's available through NuGet, so you can go and grab that. The URIs that you use to access data through OData are all described and documented up in the OData documentation, and there's these OData query strings that you can play around with, etc. So with that, let me jump into my last demo here and look at creating and consuming a WCF data service. So I'll jump back over here, close this app down, and I've got a couple other projects now. I've got a placeholder for a WCF data service, and this is just a web project. It's an empty web project with nothing in it. And then I have yet one more WPF guy that looks just like the first one did. A little button that can go get positions from somewhere and then show them in a list view, just like my first demo, right? So over here for my WCF data service, I again need a data model. Now, I'm gonna go build one again because it doesn't take that long to get through that process. But when I came back up here and built this database first model, I could have done that in a separate class library and then referenced that library from multiple projects. The only thing that I would have had to do is make sure to copy the entity connection string over into the config of the calling app. But anyhow, it's quick enough to go do another one, and what the heck, doesn't hurt to see it again. So I'm going to come in here and do a WCF data service. So I'm going to right-click on this and add in, before that, my ADO.NET entity data model. This is going to be my positions entity model. We're going to do generate from database. It already remembers my connection strings. This all looks wonderful. This is not the code first stuff. Yes, include it. And we're going to, oh, no, that was the wrong database. Put me into master. I wasn't being careful there. Gotta pick positions, not master. There we go. Test it, make sure it looks good and okay. And looks good, and this is going to be my positions context, just like we did before, just being consistent with my naming, etc. And yes, please include the password for me. Again, I get the choice of EF6 versus EF5. I'm going to pick EF6. And I'm going to pull in, actually, do I want the whole thing? Yeah, I do. I want the whole thing. Grab all of those guys. Positions model, sounds good. Finish that up. Now, before I continue with that, there is a little bit that I need to do to get WCF Data Services 5.6 to work with EF 6.0. And there's this Microsoft.OData.Entity Framework Provider pre-release package that I need to add in here. So before I create the data service, I'm going to first come over here and add in, oh, sorry, yes, let it build the T4 templates. Don't tell me about them again. Waiting for it to pull my designer up here for me. And I'm going to fix crews here before I forget. Cool. All right. And so now I'm going to right click up here on the project and go to Manage NuGet Packages. And paste in the name of that package. But here I do have to make sure that I had include pre-release selected, because this is a pre-release package right now. That'll change in the future, but right now it's what I need for WCF 5.6 or Data Services 5.6 and Entity Framework 6.0 or later. So I'll install that. And basically what it's going to do is allow me to create a WCF data service that can work on a DB context rather than just an object context. So I'll accept all the things it wants me to agree to. And close that up. All right, and so now I can come in and right-click in here and add in a new WCF Data Service 5.6. And I'm going to call it, actually, what do I want to call it? WCF Position Service. Good enough. All right, and so with my positions service, it creates this thing that is a data service. But I need this to actually be an entity framework. And that's what I pulled in with that NuGet package that allows it to work with EF6. So that's going to be what I use. And then you tell this data service what's the data model that it exposes. And I have that positions context. That's the data model that we're going to expose through this. Now, with your positions context, there's actually a number of subsets of data. There's positions, cruises, places, time zones, etc. And so you down here get to decide through what are called entity access rules, what are the various subsets that you want to expose and to what extent do you want to expose them. Now, for a demo, I'm going to go pretty broad here, but you could say, you know what, just expose the positions and only allow read access or something like that. I'm going to go ahead and expose everything, and I'm going to allow all rights. Okay, this is kind of like that fire me rule that we had over there before. You want to be careful about doing this kind of stuff, but this is a demo, so I'm going to do that. All right, so that's it. I mean, that was really, I mean, if I hadn't had to pull that NuGet package in there in the middle, I built a model, and then I added this thing and changed a couple of lines of code, and boom, that's it, right? So that's really cool. So now let me, over here in my data service, I'm going to right-click on this guy, this position service, and just say, let's go view in browser. And you'll notice that now it's telling me, here's the collections that are available through this data service. I've got cruises, places, positions, time zones, etc. So let's go, I'm going to grab cruises.
It's almost like the service metadata with WCF.
Yeah, yeah, very much like so. And here I'm actually able to go pull back cruises and retrieve those guys. That's really cool. Or I could come back. I don't want to pull back all the positions because there's a ton of them, but I could say, hey, just go get position number 1 for me. And it retrieves the single position. Is that cool or what? I love that. That's awesome stuff, right? And then there's all these different sort of query strings filters that you can add on here, right? So I can say, oh, go ahead and expand for me the place. So follow that navigation property, follow the join, and go pull back the join or the place data along with that position so I can see it. And so when I call it that way, you'll notice that I actually get back, where do I? Where is it? Place ID, expand place. I don't see it. Let me try it without expand place. Boy, that looks the same to me. And maybe I had a problem on my model there. Let's pull a different place, or a different position. 120. I don't know where it's at. All right, never mind me. You can also add in the filters, like filter, place name equals, Bahamas. Or actually, that would be it's country.
Zoom in on that a little bit.
Yes, it will do. Thank you. Equals Bahamas, or Bimini. There we go. But anyhow, so I'm able to go in. It did retrieve. Oh, let's get rid of positions. Oh, that's why. Let's get rid of positions 120. See if that works. There you go. All right, so this is pulling back all the positions from the place Bimini, and I think I'm eventually going to get some data. Do I see Bimini in there? I don't know. I feel like it's not doing my expand for me. Well, if that's the case, blame me, not it. Something I'm doing stupid if that's not I'm not seeing it, so it's probably something I'm doing silly there.
So the way to think about this, Brett, is that up there in the address bar, I'm effectively passing a query off to the back end, and it's figuring out what that query means and sending back just those results. So it's very efficient.
Yeah, in fact, it's taking those query string parameters and turning them into link, right? And then running that against my entity model and pulling back the data for me. So it's kind of like the query string goes to link, the link goes to the entity provider, and the entity provider turns it into a query on the back end and then pulls my data back up for me. So it's really cool, right? So some cool stuff there. And then the other thing I can do then is, of course, come in and reference this from a client. So back up here with my WCF Data Service client, I can actually add a service reference off to that WCF Data Service because it's discoverable. It's got metadata. And so this add service reference in Visual Studio knows how to go read those. And I won't follow all the way through this. We've seen this add services and call into them here. But I can now do that and then go in and get to the places, do link queries against that data and manipulate it. So it's really, really cool stuff. Did I say really enough times? Sorry. Anything to add to that?
No, so when I think about OData, it's essentially taking REST and making it more like SOAP and service metadata, giving you that extra layer of discoverability.
At least giving you that formalization, so it's easier to understand what you're approaching, right? And then from there, with metadata coming back, you can discover it, and yeah, definitely. Not as heavy as SOAP, but still, it's sort of halfway between pure REST and pure SOAP.
And I believe you can even do updates and CRUD operations with OData, not just reads.
Yep. So you can use the HTTP verbs and ship up changes and all that good stuff. So yeah, definitely. All right. Well, hopefully, again, that gave you a good feel of sort of entity framework, how that fits into our data access technologies. Talked about WCF Data Services and how they can allow us to sort of expose data models. And with that, we'll go ahead and again take a break, and we'll start back up in about 10 minutes.
Thanks, everyone.